Let me show you the story of our totally uncharacteristic, socially distanced, COVID-19 avoiding 3.5-day cross-country dash. Welcome to the initial episode of RV Life in 3/4 time, a vlog covering our adoption of the RV lifestyle. We are Cheryl and Carl Pearson, and here we're documenting the transition from our current lifestyle to our chosen adaptation of RV life, and hopefully passing along some useful information to others as we progress. We had planned for some time to start up a blog or YouTube channel, in great part to learn new skills, to take on new challenges as we transition into retirement. And we had a plan. We had developed a list of startup topics, categories, had everything laid out in a logical progression. And then COVID-19 came along and upset everybody's plans. To set this up, we live out in the woods west of Atlanta, Georgia. Our daughter and son-in-law, for professional career choices, have fairly recently moved to Seattle, Washington. Last fall, we were overjoyed to learn that they were expecting their first child, that we'd have another grandchild. And we began to make plans. Of course, without an exact due date, our plans were reduced to relying on the understanding of our respective workplaces that our time off this spring would have a somewhat variable start date, and we were pretty much resigned to the apparent fact that when the time came, we would need to purchase last-minute, high-priced airline tickets. As spring approached and the COVID crisis deepened, and for a time Seattle became the U.S. epicenter for the disease due to the outbreak in the King County Senior Care Facility, we grew concerned. We weren't comfortable with the idea of flying from Atlanta to Seattle, even though by then there weren't that many people flying, so being exposed on a flight probably wasn't all that probable, but we still weren't comfortable with traveling through the open spaces required for us to reach our destination. And besides, who knew what state airline travel might be in when it came time for us to return home? There were concerns which caused the obstetrician to set a date on which to induce labor, and as that date approached, the timing part of the puzzle fell into place, but we still weren't comfortable with the idea of flying to Seattle. And that's where the latest addition to what has now become our mini fleet of RVs came into play. This is our latest RV, a 2005 Winnebago Aspect 23D. We call it the Go Buggy because we intend to use it for shorter, more spur-of-the-moment trips. We already have a pop-up camper that we intend to sell, and a fifth wheel with dually that we intend to keep for more extended trips. By most measures, the Aspect is a small Class C. Without the storage area over the cab, many would call it a B+. It has a fiberglass roof and is built on the Ford E350 frame powered by a 10-cylinder gasoline engine. We picked this rig up from a dealer, Three-Way Camper in Marietta, Georgia. We really enjoyed dealing with them, finding the experience to be more laid back than some we've had at other more high-pressure sales locations. However, we did find one issue. We discovered leaks where the RV body met the E350 cab. When it rained, water would ooze through the sealant. It hadn't caused much damage, but needed to be dealt with. Since it was within the first 30 days, we took the rig back to the dealer. They did get the leak plugged, but it proved to be tricky. It took 3 attempts before we were satisfied with the results. And now it was well into March, and we were seriously considering driving to Seattle. If we were going to get any renovations done before the trip, we would have to get on the ball. First, we stripped the worn and faded carpet from the RV body and replaced it with vinyl plank flooring. We replaced incandescent light bulbs with LEDs. We replaced the dated and burnt out light over the dinette with a more contemporary fixture. Cheryl covered the dinette and jackknife sofa cushions with blue slip covers. With the due date rapidly approaching and COVID-19 fears seemingly growing by the hour, we finalized our decision to drive to Seattle. Any further renovations would have to wait till after our trip. Now it was time for us to sit down and plot out our route. Checking with Google Maps, there were 3 suggested routes. Since we were leaving on Saturday and wanted to arrive before our daughter's departure for the hospital on Tuesday, we chose the quickest option, a route around 2,600 miles long, averaging about 660 miles a day. Not an obscene daily distance, but one I wouldn't undertake unless the driving duties were shared. The Friday before we left, we set about getting things ready for tomorrow's departure. We rechecked all the recently examined vehicle fluids. We checked the air pressure in all 6 tires. We lowered the dinette into the bed position so we could stow a gift refinished rocking chair. We stuffed as much as we could get into the wireframe pantry next to the refrigerator, more than we really needed, in part to see how much it would hold. The next morning we still had several loose ends to tie up before we could leave. As those items neared completion, we discovered that the right front tire, recently checked, was now completely flat. I jumped to the conclusion that it was a bad valve core, found a replacement, then realized it wasn't the valve core at all, but rather the valve extension, which was wore out and leaking. I removed the extension, aired the tire up with our portable Vi-Air compressor, and we were finally ready to go. By now, to our dismay, it was almost noon. Finally, we were on the road. I drove as we set out. We gassed up the go buggy, merged onto I-75 near Cartersville, and I drove until we reached the last Georgia rest area just before Chattanooga, where Cheryl took over driving duties. Cheryl merged onto I-24 at Chattanooga, drove north, up through Nashville, into western Kentucky, and through Paducah, finally rolling into southern Illinois. We stopped at a rest area near Rend Lake to heat up a quick dinner. We parked away from other vehicles, ran our generator just long enough to heat up some soup. Then I resumed driving as we set out towards St. Louis. It was well after 9 p.m. when we reached St. Louis. I drove on until we came to the I-70 rest stop at Wright City. After resting a few minutes, we decided to carry on, so Cheryl picked up driving the rig and drove the next 100 or so miles to the next rest stop at Boonville. By the time we stopped for the evening, it was almost midnight, much later than we had planned, but we had gotten a very late start. Our first day's travel covered about 710 miles in around 12 hours. We set out shortly after dawn on the second day of our travels. Turning north at Kansas City on I-29, we drove through far western Iowa, seeing the buildings of Omaha across the Nebraska River as we drove by. We passed into South Dakota and headed towards Sioux Falls. One concern we had was the weather. The possibility that this far north we might see some snowfall and potentially need snow chains, something we don't normally think about much in the southeast. We searched online and found an AutoZone location in Sioux Falls that had snow chains in stock. We probably wouldn't need them on this trip, but if we travel as much as we plan, we may well need chains in the future. So we figured it was better to have them and not need them than to need them and not have them. So it's worth the risk to stop and get the chains. After all, South Dakota wasn't exactly a COVID-19 hotbed. We stopped at Sioux Falls and were able to obtain the chains with minimal human contact. Leaving Sioux Falls, heading west on I-90, we continued looking for a place to stay that evening. Checking with Google and Campendium and calling a couple of locations, we realized something that hadn't occurred to us before, being from a warmer climate. Many RV camps this far north would have very little winter activity, so it's not worth it for them to invest in the infrastructure to protect their water supplies from freezing. Most camps this far north wouldn't be open till at least mid-April, perhaps May. We were able to talk to the owner of Owl's Oasis Campground, just off I-90 near Chamberlain and the Missouri River. He said they weren't open, but if we wanted to drop a half-rate payment in the drop box, we could stay, with electric and sewer hookups, but no water. Since it was close to the interstate, this worked for us. We settled in just as the sun was setting. Our total mileage this day was around 605 miles, done in approximately 10 hours. One of the precautions we took for the trip was that for 2 weeks prior, during, and for some time after we returned home, we twice daily took and recorded our temperatures. If we had seen any sort of spike, our plans would have immediately changed. One thing that struck us during the trip was seeing the Sinclair oil logo. Being raised in the South, we had both seen this symbol in our youth, but probably hadn't seen it in almost 50 years. A quick history check shows that Sinclair, due to antitrust concerns, had been required to sell its East Coast holdings to BP in the late 1960s. Being around 10 or 11 at that time, we weren't really aware of such events. So for us, seeing that logo was a somewhat bizarre and truly nostalgic experience. Another precaution we took was gassing up using pay at the pump and employing nitrile gloves, having a ready supply, already using them for sewer hose duties. I employed a one-glove approach. Anytime I touched anything on the rig, it was with the ungloved hand. Anytime I touched the pump or any public surfaces, it was with the gloved hand. As the pump began filling the RV fuel tank, I would go to the cab, giving Cheryl the credit card. She would sanitize the card using an alcohol-based hand sanitizer while I returned to monitor the fill. After pumping the gas, I disposed of the glove, closed the gasoline access point, went back to the cab, and just for good measure, once again applied our favorite hand sanitizer. The next morning we set out again on I-90 through the South Dakota grasslands. Long stretches of straight road with only an occasional curve. We regretfully passed by several locations that we have wanted to and will eventually visit, but unfortunately they just weren't part of our current journey. After passing Sturgis near Belle Fourche, we exited I-90 for a stretch on Highway 34 to Highway 212 through the northeast corner of Wyoming. This is not a controlled access highway, but there was very little traffic, few towns, mainly long stretches that looked something like this. We merged back onto I-90 just east of Billings, Montana. Then we drove on through to the rest area near Bozeman, where we stopped for dinner. We had originally planned on resting in Bozeman that evening, but checking the weather we saw a forecast for snow on the Homestake Pass above Butte in the wee hours of the morning. Wanting to get over that pass before any foul weather hit, we pushed on in the dark and crossed the Continental Divide. We descended from the pass down through the sparkling night lights of Butte, finally stopping for the evening at the I-90 rest area near Anaconda. This was the longest travel day of our journey, covering almost 760 miles in roughly 13 hours. The morning of what would be our last day on the road dawned, and we found a icy crust of snow on the rest area parking lot and on our rig. So we decided it would be best to wait a little while and let road conditions improve before we set out. After things warmed a little, I got out, cleared cake snow off of the rig, and began our travel checks. Cheryl noticed that the passenger side outer dually tire looked low. Checking the pressure, it seemed fine, but then I realized I couldn't readily find the valve extender for the inside tire. I realized the inside tire was flat, and the outer tire looked a little low because it was bearing an extra load. We had to consider options. Changing the tires in the slanted, icy parking lot didn't seem advisable. I checked online for tire shops nearby and found a chain called Les Schwab with locations back in Butte and one a few miles down the road in a place called Deer Lodge. Checking with the shop, they said yes, they're open and they could help us out. So we got in the rig, cranked up, rolled across the icy parking lot onto I-90. By now, the road conditions were not too bad. There were still icy patches on the interstate, but With next to no traffic on the road, we slowly, gingerly headed west towards Deer Lodge and the tire shop. The guys at the shop were great. They checked things out, found we had the same issue we had discovered earlier, the valve extension. The inner extension had gone completely bad, and the outer had developed a small leak. In less than 45 minutes, they had things checked out, replaced the extensions, reinflated the tire, and checked the other tires. The charge for the service was about $40, well worth it to keep from having to crawl around on the icy rest area parking lot. At the checkout, the cashier wore gloves. We were all distanced. I inserted my credit card, made the payment, went back to our rig, again slathered my hands in disinfectant, and we were back on the road. Unfortunately, the extra time we took to let the roads improve, along with the time it took to fix the tire, meant that we weren't going to be able to safely get to our daughter's home before the couple set out for the hospital. We called them to let them know the situation. They gave us directions to park and get into their home when we got there. We wished them luck, sent our love, then settled down for the last leg of our dash. We began crossing the Bitterroot Range, traveling into the Stovepipe portion of Idaho. On one particular mountain pass, we had a snow squall just fall on us like a fog bank. It was quite impressive, but didn't really cause a problem. The surface temperatures kept us from having any real trouble. From there, we descended down the pass, down the valley towards and through Coeur d'Alene, through Spokane, and into central Washington. We were treated to a beautiful sunset as we continued heading west. We crossed the Columbia River, and it was dark as we hit Ellensburg, and I took over driving for the very final leg of our trip. We did encounter one final snow squall as we went through Snoqualmie Pass before descending down towards Seattle. This last leg covered about 580 miles in around 11 hours. In total, we drove about 2,660 miles on 4 travel days. So, going from our midday departure on Saturday till our near midnight Eastern Time arrival on Tuesday, it was about a 3.5-day trip. Due to COVID-19, we couldn't go to the hospital for the birth. We could only stay at their home, eagerly awaiting any news. During that time, we did unload and set up the rocking chair Cheryl had recovered, and we had transported cross-country in the Go Buggy. And finally, they were home, and we were there to be grandparents, to play baby, to share our love and what support we could offer to the happy couple and their beautiful newborn daughter, if only for a little while. After a week and a half, much too soon, the press of other responsibilities called us home. We had a final family dinner together, and then we packed our bags and got ready to leave early the next day. The drive home was much more relaxed than the trip out. Cheryl shouldered most of the driving chores as I was using my phone as a hotspot and working online as we traveled. Instead of retracing our route, we headed southward, merging onto I-25 south from I-90 and driving through eastern Wyoming, through Colorado to I-70, then through Kansas, finally began retracing our original route beginning at Kansas City. We stayed at several private camps on the way home, some scenic, some just gravel lots near the expressway, but all sharing one characteristic. We could register and pay for our stay with no human contact at all. Either through after-hours drop boxes or phone registration, we were able to stay all but one night with full hookups, and no real human contact, all at sites near enough to the interstate to allow us to get back on the road easily the next day. One striking aspect of the drive home was gas prices. Because of local price variations, lack of demand due to COVID-19, and possibly even the Saudi-Russia price war, we found gas prices, particularly in Kansas and Missouri, to be quite low. By this time, most national and state parks were closed, and while we didn't have the opportunity to do any exploration, we did take the time on our way back to stop and catch at least a few interesting images. On the last day of our return, we had planned on stopping around Clarksville, Tennessee, and staying the night, but we decided to go ahead and push our way on home. Our last rest break was at a rest area on an island in a reservoir on the Tennessee River just outside of Chattanooga. This stop was too small to accommodate semis or larger RVs, but it was perfect for the go buggy. When we set out, things were a bit gray in the southeast. Now the light green spring colors of the new leaves was refreshing. And from there, we pushed our way on home. So what were the takeaways from our little adventure? Well, I think it fits into 4 categories. First, the trip itself. We have traveled out west before, but never taken a road trip, and that's something we really want to be able to do in the future, so this was a bit of a dry run for us. But it really wasn't an RV trip as much as it was a cross-country road trip, utilizing the unique characteristics of a motorhome to be able to maintain safe social distancing. And from that viewpoint, things worked very well. The second category is the maiden voyage of the go buggy, and that went pretty well. I did have some concerns about going across mountain passes with a gasoline engine, but we weren't towing anything behind us or loaded very heavily, and the rig did just fine. We did have some issues, however. When loaded, we had difficulty getting out of our own driveway without dragging the rear end, and there was more play, more sway in the steering than we really liked. I feel more comfortable towing our fifth wheel behind the dually than I currently do driving this rig. We're considering investing in heavier sway bars and steering damper, and maybe even lifting the rig, at least beefing up the suspension. But overall, it was a pretty good experience. Third, our initial YouTube experience. Mixed reviews there. As I said before, we're taking this on to learn new skills, to take on new challenges, and it was a challenge. I lost a good bit of road footage from mismanagement of my SD cards. I should have known better from my photography background, but I took a good bit of footage that was just too shaky to use. So editing this was harder than it should have been, and I ended up with more stills, and it was a little more talking headish than I would have liked. But we decided to go ahead and dive in rather than wait for some unattainable ideal. It's a learning experience. We will get better. And the final takeaway was the people. Now, we didn't come in contact with a large number of people by design, as you can guess, but when we did, those few times, the people were great. This was before most lockdowns. States were just beginning to lock down as we began our return trip. But people were already being respectful, giving others space in public places. And businesses were taking steps to protect their customers and their employees. Gloves, counter shields, limited contact procedures. There will always be outliers in any situation, but in our experience, most people and businesses will normally try to do the right thing. Well, that's about it for the initial episode of RV Life in 3/4 time. Please comment below. Share your experiences with RV life and travel in the time of COVID-19. If you enjoyed or found value in this, please like and subscribe. We don't have a regular posting schedule yet, but we will soon. Our next post will detail the renovations and upgrades that we've added to our new 15-year-old motorhome. Until then, find your style, get out there, and enjoy the ride.